It was to be just another congressional hearing, until Rep. Jasmine Crockett strode into the room with confidence, set to school two of America's most veteran conservative judges on constitutional law. In mere seconds, however, the mood changed. What happened in that chamber not only surprised the spectators, it shook the entire judicial world and possibly killed Crockett's political career. The moment of change arrived when Judge Clarence Thomas slammed down his gavel, and Justice Neil Gorsuch suddenly sprang to his feet, staring hard at Crockett. From that instant on, everyone present knew this would not be business as usual. What followed was not merely a battle of egos. It was a collision of historic proportions between ideology, experience, and naked political ambition. Before we go any further into this incredible courtroom thriller that is now dominating the internet, make sure you're subscribed and you've hit the notification bell. Believe me, you won't want to miss it. The stress within the hearing room was near hyperventilating, heavy enough to cut through. Crockett, a Democrat from Texas and 5 years young, came in with her characteristic brashness, prepared, as always, to provide biting one-liners and authoritative sound bites for the cameras. What she was not prepared for, however, was confronting two of the best legal brains on the planet, men who were not going to sit back and allow a politician to make a circus out of the hearing. What started as a standard constitutional oversight hearing quickly degenerated into one of the judiciary's most explosive confrontations in decades before it was all over. It wasn't just Crockett who was left reeling. It was an entire country stuck to their screens. To appreciate just how electrifying this confrontation was, let's start by examining the two towering figures at its center. Now, at 5 years old, Justice Clarence Thomas has become the embodiment of conservative judicial ideology. His personal story, from a childhood living in poverty in Georgia, brought up by his grandfather after his own father abandoned the family, to being one of the nation's leading legal thinkers, is truly inspiring. For more than 3 decades, he has been an unyielding champion of constitutional originalism and individual freedom. Alongside him stands Justice Neil Gorsuch, the recent conservative face. Gorsuch, at Fay, brings a formidable combination of Ivy League cred and down-home Western sensibility. Referred to as the master of cutting-edge legal writing and strict textualist interpretation of the Constitution, he has risen to become a respected voice on the nation's highest bench. Together, Thomas and Gorsuch make an intimidating duo, a team that has repeatedly struck down judicial activism, ignoring political pressure and media furor. And then there is Representative Jasmine Crockett. Despite being relatively new to Congress, having been elected in Fay, she has established a reputation for bombastic attacks on conservatives and incendiary soundbites crafted to go viral on social media. A former civil rights lawyer, Crockett is now a budding star of the progressive movement, championing her side with zeal but routinely excoriated for failing to be substantively supported by law. To her supporters, she is fearless and unflinching. To her detractors, reckless and unprepared. This constitutional oversight hearing was more than a debate. Progressives had been pressing for months to get conservative judges on their heels, seeing the moment as an opportunity to generate viral moments that could be used to make the case for expanding or reshaping the Supreme Court. Crockett was their messenger, running through talking points, working with activist groups, and staging the setting for a fiery showdown. But here is the catch. Thomas and Gorsuch weren't TV commentators or politicians. They were veteran legal titans, battle-hardened after decades of surviving much harder tests than a theatrical new congresswoman. When Crockett finally took them on, the trenches were dug. On the one hand, progressive activism, noisy, passionate, and media-friendly. On the other, constitutional scholarship, persistent, unbending, and long-grounded in decades of legal tradition. And then what? Well, it would leave even the most experienced political observers speechless. Nobody in that room anticipated how thoroughly the young congresswoman was going to get outgunned by two judicial giants. Initially, the hearing went on as usual, procedural questions, courteous exchanges, the sort of pacing that makes people believe that it is going to be routine. However, beneath the FAI, tension was palpable. Representative Crockett sat at the committee table, occasionally whispering to her staff, obviously waiting for the limelight, and when her turn finally came, She didn't warm up with pleasantness. She dived right into the attack. "Judge Thomas, Judge Gorsuch," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "Your rulings show a pattern of judicial activism and an obvious bias against civil rights. You've disregarded the constitutional rights of minorities and women again and again." The charge hit like a thunderbolt. Across the room, phones dropped. Reporters sat up, pens poised. Even the security guards, normally stoic and immobile, seemed to feel something tectonic was on the verge of happening. Thomas and Gorsuch shared a single glance: silence. But charged they'd been attacked countless times previously, naturally. But few had ever been bold enough to start out with an accusation so incendiary, so unsubstantiated, and in such a formal venue. The subsequent silence hung like a frozen breath. But Crockett misconstrued that silence as triumph. She continued with even greater passion. "Your rulings consistently favor corporations over ordinary people," she declared, rifling through her prepared notes. "You've dismantled decades of civil rights progress. Originalism isn't justice. It's just a smokescreen for regressive policies that hurt working families." Her words rang with professional assurance. She was speaking lines she obviously thought would catch on, lines designed to cast her as unafraid. Behind her, aides nodded in agreement, and liberal activists in the balcony leaned forward, eager for more explosions. Then she went on to do more, pointing her finger straight at Justice Thomas. "And your refusal to recuse yourself from cases where you have clear conflicts of interest shows you have nothing but contempt for judicial ethics. The American people deserve better." For the first time, Thomas moved, his jaw clenched, and his normally steady eyes flashed with contained anger. At his side, Gorsuch rocked back ever so slightly, a near deferential motion. But those who had worked with him knew it, he was thinking. When upset, his reputation was not for getting loud. It was for delivering silently devastating counterarguments that made one's position unthinkable. Crockett, however, took their quietness as weakness. "I'm not finished," she announced, though no one had interrupted her. Her tone turned more acidic as she doubled up. "Your decisions reveal an overt agenda to unwind safeguards for the most vulnerable in our society. This textualism mania is so last century, it is hurting contemporary America." She paused, expecting some sort of retort. There was none. The room was heavy with expectation, and she made the mistake again, taking their silence as a door opened to her. Now she focused squarely on Gorsuch. "Justice Gorsuch, your affluent upbringing is evident in your rulings. You repeatedly align with corporate might because you simply cannot connect with the plight of ordinary Americans. Your judicial philosophy is merely elitism masquerading in the guise of legal technicalities to benefit the rich." The accusation landed with impact. At the committee table, some members shifted uneasily. Murmurs circulated in the gallery. Even many of Thomas and Gorsuch's opponents recognized Crockett was walking a thin line. Yet she wasn't finished. She was building toward her so-called knockout blow, a broadside at the essence of their judicial vision. "Your so-called originalist reading of the Constitution is a cage," she declared, her voice growing stronger with emotion. "It denies the living, changing character of our democracy. The founders never meant their words to be set in stone, leaving America stuck in the past. Your strict fixation on the 18th century is keeping us from justice in the 21st. And with that, the needle turned. This was not politics anymore. Crockett had struck directly at the philosophical center of Thomas and Gorsuch, at the corner on which they had built their life's work. On the bench, Judge Thomas's fingers tapped once, sharp, deliberate, a sign of irritation visible to anyone who noticed. Next to him, Gorsuch's face set into something unmistakable, not anger, but what witnesses would later characterize as judicial displeasure. The room no longer stood with Crockett. The question was no longer whether the judges would react, it was how. By this point, it was obvious that Crockett believed she held the advantage. Aromas of blood in the water, she opted to strike at what she perceived would be her coup de grace face. "And let's discuss ethics," she declared, sharpening her tone like steel. "Judge Thomas, your wife's political endeavors create undeniable conflicts of interest. And Judge Gorsuch, Your corporate connections prior to taking the bench demonstrate precisely where your allegiances belong. No longer was this the typical going back and forth of party combat. These were official charges of judicial misconduct, thrown in one of the most significant hearings of the year. The air grew thick instantly. Committee staff wrote madly. Reporters pounded their keyboards. The gallery sat in complete stillness, aware they were watching something historic and perhaps unprecedented. But here is what Crockett did not see. She had just crossed a line no one, not even the most strident critics of these judges, had previously dared to cross. Thomas and Gorsuch had weathered decades of court fights, media assaults, and scholarly criticism. But never before had anyone, in an official forum, made such a broad and personal attack on their integrity, their history, and the very underpinnings of their judicial worldview. The silence pulled out. It was so complete that folks promised they could hear the soft whir of the air conditioning above. And then it came. Judge Thomas slowly extended his hand for the gavel. Gorsuch sat back in his seat, placing both hands palm down on the bench. Small gestures, but lethal in their intent. Anyone who knew their courtroom etiquette understood. The storm was about to erupt. And somehow, miraculously, Crockett wasn't finished. Misinterpreting their restraint as vulnerability, she delivered another blow. "The American people are watching," she said, jabbing both judges with dramatic disdain. "They see through your partisanship and your moral failures. Your era of unaccountable power is coming to an end, and progressive voices like mine will ensure it." She settled back, pleased, convinced she had delivered her knockout blow. She anticipated cheers, approval nods, perhaps even shouting from the gallery. What happened next left everyone aghast. Judge Clarence, Thomas lifted his gavel and came down with it with a resounding crack. The sound was like a gunshot reverberating throughout the hearing room with such force that people leapt bodily from their seats. Crockett's grin disintegrated at once, replaced by gaping shock, and then he stood up slowly, intentionally, like a man shouldering the full burden of 3 decades on the nation's highest bench. His measured calm was abandoned. In its place, something never seen before. "Disciplined judicial rage, Representative Crockett," Thomas started, his deep, deliberate voice ringing loudly throughout the room. "In 32 years on the bench, I have never seen such a degrading spectacle of ignorance masquerading as constitutional oversight." The words hit like body blows. Everywhere, mouths agape, phones went up to record the moment for the headlines and history books. But Thomas was not finished. "You sit there," he went on, gesturing specifically at Crockett, who recoiled visibly in her seat. "Virtually 2 years in Congress, and think you can teach me about constitutional interpretation. You, who have never written one line of important legislation. You, who have never argued one case before an appellate court. You, who continually demonstrate you know not the law nor the Constitution you swore to preserve." He did not shout. Once, he did not need to. His tongue sliced like a scalpel, spoken in surgical cadence, and the commanding tones of a great jurist tearing down an inferior impostor. The chamber was transfixed. Crockett attempted to interrupt, her lips parting in indignation. Thomas hushed her with a raised hand. "Your charges of judicial activism," he added, "reflect a basic misunderstanding of what judges do. We don't make law, Representative. We interpret it. We don't manufacture rights ex nihilo to advance the politics of the day. We apply the Constitution as written, not as you would have it written." And then, just as the gravity of Thomas's thunderous denunciation lingered in the air, it was time for Gorsuch. He stood up calmly, his face set and unyielding, his voice sporting the low rumble of his Western accent. If Thomas had been thunder, Gorsuch was lightning. Cutting, accurate, fatal. "Representative Crockett," he declared with crisp acidity, "you've just wasted 10 minutes establishing you don't know the first thing about constitutional law, judicial ethics, or even rudimentary legal thinking." The crowd did not breathe. They sensed the actual storm had barely commenced. For an instant, Gorsuch just let the gravity of his final comment rest. The silence was damning enough. Then, surgically, he cut in. "You charge us with bias," he replied calmly, "while showing the most blatant bias I've ever witnessed at a congressional hearing. You say we disregard the Constitution, yet your statements demonstrate that you've probably never read it. You appeal to ethics, all while making irresponsible charges with no trace of supporting evidence. The punches were successive, measured, destructive, impossible to avoid. Crockett's confidence FIA was starting to break, but the next thing that happened was no longer about defending themselves. It was far bigger than that. A live public masterclass in constitutional law in front of the nation. Let's discuss originalism, Thomas started, his anger spent once more giving way to professorial precision, as if he had slid into the teacher's role he had long played. You call it outmoded, that it keeps America stuck. Tell me then, Representative, what is your alternative? Do judges make up the law on the fly? Do we revise the Constitution whenever it is politically inopportune? Crockett stumbled, sputtering out half-baked sentences about living constitutionalism. Thomas dismissed her words. Living constitutionalism, he echoed, his tone now dripping with contempt. That is not a philosophy. That is a slogan. It means that judges disregard the law when progressive activists do not like it. It is politics disguised as jurisprudence. And that, Representative, is exactly what the Constitution was designed to avoid. Not missing a beat. Gorsuch picked up the thread and pulled it tighter. The Constitution is not a suggestion, Representative Crockett, he stated with conviction. It is not something we do when we feel like it. It is the law of the land. And when we engage in originalism, we are not forcing our will, we are limiting it. We are acknowledging that our will is not higher than the will of the Constitution itself. To do otherwise, he said with narrowed eyes, would be to betray our oath and the people we serve. The blow to her arguments was finished, but the judges weren't done yet. They directed their attention now to the most intimate portion of her diatribe, her charges of ethics abuses. Thomas leaned forward, his voice lowering, and somehow making it all the more powerful. You care to discuss ethics, Representative? He spoke slowly, then let us discuss it. About the ethics of a sitting congressman exploiting an official oversight hearing for vacuous political theater. About the ethics of leveling sensational allegations against federal judges on the basis of not even one known documented fact. About the ethics of involving the families and personal lives of judges in your showmanship, and not our actual decisions and legal analysis. The admonishment struck with gut-wrenching impact. Crockett visibly flinched, leaning back in her chair as if physically pushed. She had arrived to commandeer the story, but instead found herself being relentlessly taken apart, and the cameras were recording every moment. Next came the phrase Gorsuch would be quoted on endlessly in the coming days. His voice remained even, but his words were charged with metal. Representative Crockett, he declared, you entered today anticipating judges who would cringe under your accusations, judges who would apologize for doing their duty faithfully to the Constitution, judges who would yield to political pressure or bow a knee to Twitter mobs. What you have instead are judges who will not be bullied by anyone. Not by politicians, not by activists, not by you. But somehow, the most astonishing moment was yet to come. Thomas stood up again, but this time with the severe solemnity of a man pronouncing judgment. His tone changed from cutting criticism to something that sounded unmistakably like a formal verdict. Representative Crockett, he stated, his voice booming with commanding authority. Your performance today has been an embarrassment, not merely to yourself and not merely to your constituents, but to this very institution of Congress. The silence was total. No phones were tapped, no papers shuffled. Even Crockett's own employees, formerly full of nods and grins, sat stiff and white. Both of you have demonstrated an ignorance of constitutional law that should shame a first-year law student, Thomas added. You have made irresponsible charges with not an inkling of proof. You have dishonored the integrity of this court with nothing but partisan spectacle. And in so doing, you have demonstrated to the American people precisely what happens when ideology tries to masquerade as legal argumentation. The air in the room felt like it was compressed with the force of his words. Crockett's stance had crumpled completely. Her elaborate scheme to engineer a viral success had turned into the exact opposite, a viral embarrassment. And then Gorsuch gave the line that would be splashed across headlines and social media. Representative, he said, his tone sharp as broken glass. You came here to put us on trial. Instead, you've just put yourself on display for the whole nation to see.